Welcome back to Supersymmetry. It's been a while, hasn't it? To recap, in the last episode, we delved into the Steam Age and acquired our first primitive circuits. With those in hand, we now have to conquer low voltage and obtain medium voltage technology. Before all that, though, I wanted to clean up my base a little and actually give it a floor, as there was no way I'm progressing through this pack in a crap shack lawn base. So I tore up my lawn and began installing a nice floor. Going forward, I decided on a kind of rough industrial aesthetic that, to be honest, is so unoriginal for a Gregification base I may as well copy a blueprint, but you know, whatever, I like how it looks. I also decided to drastically improve my storage situation with a storage rack, as I could store hundreds of items in there for just some chests and steel. I placed it on my new platform. I proceeded to move all my items into the rack and move a workstation there too. With my crafting and storage connected, I crafted my first actual LV machine, the wire mill, which allowed me to turn ingots directly into wires at a 1:2 ratio. If it isn't obvious, I'm not going to cover every single little machine I build or thing I do, as the LV age is a long one and there's around 36 hours of footage, so this video is going to stick to like important milestones to keep it as watchable as possible. So if it feels like my base is like slightly different in different cuts, it is. LV machines aren't cheap, so I decided I needed some sort of ore processing to at least assist with the hundreds of ingots I needed. The steam grinder was a 3x3x3 multi-block that would allow me to process one ore into 2 ingots, like the steam macerator, but it was much faster. With the grinder running in the background, it was time to start giving my base more than just a floor. You see, LV machines would explode if rain touched them, so it was important to have a roof over my head. Also, these catwalks are like really fucking sick. Building everything takes a while, but I really like how the base is coming along. With a place for the electric machines finally built, I constructed a steam line across the main hall and attached my turbine to it, then attached my wire mill to a cable running from the turbine. The next machine to be built was the lathe, allowing me to make rods. With the wire mill and the lathe combined, my material consumption was practically halved. Life was good. To finally complete the trio of resource-saving LV machines, there was the bending machine, which made plates. The next goal was the assembling machine, a relatively expensive device that assembles more complex components than the crafting table. The recipe was pretty circa heavy, but I managed to craft it regardless. Now that I had built the assembler, I realized power generation was becoming a problem. I couldn't produce enough creosote for my liquid burners, so I built another 4 coke ovens in order to solve the problem. Meanwhile, as my grinder processed more and more ores, I realized the wall of furnaces was becoming unsustainable. So I built a large steam-powered furnace which could smelt 8 items at a time. I'd like to note that at this point bronze was pretty much free and I could use as much of it as I'd like. I then began assembling glue automation, as when used in the assembler, glue could yield me excellent rates in circuit board and resistor production. This small assembly took a while to gather all the pieces for though. In the meantime, I acquired a good bit of materials like silver and zinc. However, when I realized that distilled water isn't consumed when extracting latex from wood, I disassembled most of the automation and moved the steam turbine into the LV machine zone so it could produce the glue next to a second assembler. I also began replacing my bronze fluid pipes with potent ones as they had a larger fluid capacity and I was having trouble getting steam into my turbines. The next big goal was the electric blast furnace. Probably the most well-known multi-block from GregTech, it was the next step in alloy processing and could significantly boost my steel production. The first step was gathering material for the coils, which required me to centrifuge lava and gather copper nickel, an alloy of copper and nickel, wire. The coils also needed liquid tin alloy, so I crafted an extractor to melt the metal and insert it into the assembler's tank. And with all that out of the way, I had obtained my first copper nickel coils. While the rest of the coils were being built, I crafted the other components required for the EBF. Oh yeah, here's me actually installing the second assembler and the glue production. This kinda took a while. With all the pieces in place, I finally had all the components of the EBF, so I constructed it inside of my machine room. Now that I had the EBF, it was very much in my best interest to craft an electrolyzer, as it could provide me with hydrogen and oxygen through the electrolysis of water. These gases could be pumped into the EBF and used to smelt pig iron into iron or steel in very little time. This is how long the EBF took to smelt 38 pig iron into steel. This thing is fast as fuck. I also decided to build an alloy smelter so I could make bronze and red alloy faster. It would be little exaggeration to say energy production was the largest problem with my base through LV. In fact, my EBF was pretty much having a seizure every time it turned on because of how little capacity my grid had. Because of this, I decided to build a multi-block steam turbine, and also begin the biggest grind this pack has seen yet. Firstly, I made the casings for the turbine. These were probably the cheapest parts of the whole assembly. Typically, you'd have to get a sintering oven to have the concrete required to make them, but I just gathered it from a naturally generating outpost. Next up was the moderately more expensive alternator coil, which required 3 motors and 2 circuits each, but thankfully I only needed 3 of them. The controller of the multi-block was also a pretty cheap craft, along with actual rotors for the turbine. So at this point you're probably wondering, what could be so expensive if you've already gathered basically all the components? And the answer is a single block. The 16 amp dynamo hatch. Not only does it require like 5 microcrafting steps of different dynamo hatches before it, one of these prior crafts requires 2,000 millibuckets of lubricant. The only way to get lubricant at this stage of the game is to mix graphite with plant oil. The problem, I need 400 millibuckets of plant oil for 200 millibuckets of lubricant. A wheat seed yields a mere 10 millibuckets of plant oil when it is extracted. I was going to need 400 wheat seeds, and this wasn't about to be easy. I ended up crafting all the micro components for the dynamo hatch ahead of time. The only thing I needed was lube. Before the seed grind though, I got the required graphite from the beneath. After, while waiting for the few seeds I had to grow, I did a lot of base expansion to pass the time. In order to assist with wheat's lengthy growing process, I built a drone pad that could use drones to gather bones that I could turn into bone meal. I gotta be honest, the drone pad is a really cool addition. With seed production going up, I decided to use them to plant a massive wheat farm, as I still was only getting like 5 to 10 seeds per harvest. Honestly, building the sweet farm was like the most fun I've had in the pack so far. Well, maybe other than a few like automations. But yeah, the grind for the seed oil is not something I recommend. I don't really know why it's balanced like so strangely. When waiting for the harvests, I gathered as many materials as possible, the logic being that as soon as the turbine was built, my industrial projects would multiply tenfold and I would need resources to back them. After hours of waiting, it was time for the final harvest. Once gathered, I extracted the oil from the seeds and mixed it with graphite to finally obtain the long-awaited lubricant, and with that, I finally crafted the 16-amp dynamo hatch, allowing me to build the large steam turbine at last. Finally, the LubeQuest was over. After building the turbine, I didn't immediately hook it up to my steam production and go hog wild. Instead, I opted to improve my steam infrastructure, building 3 more water pumps in a large bronze boiler. Now, while I didn't know it at the time, the boiler would be a humongous pain in the ass, but at least the pumps functioned correctly. Also, short interlude, Supersymmetry has lost all balance. I found this crazy ass clay deposit that goes down to bedrock. Like, how the fuck does this happen? Like, God bless Gregorius T. I decided to fuel my boiler with creosote at first, so I greatly expanded the amount of coke ovens I had running and hooked them all up to it. At the same time, I used item pipes to automatically route coal from a drawer into the oven, so I didn't have to worry about fueling all of them individually. I had also made a multi-block tank to provide a creosote buffer to the boiler. The next step of the Gregification was obtaining a pyrolysis oven, as the syngas it produced would allow me to make a sintering oven, which would allow me to get a graphite electrode, blah 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 blah, final goal, aluminium. Now, if you remember all the way back to when I first obtained my EBF, I actually made 16 more coils than I needed to. These coils were for the pyrolysis oven, as I didn't anticipate the horrendous LubeQuest to take place. I did craft some extra coils though, so I could build another pyrolysis oven for other processes. By pyrolyzing coal, I could obtain syngas as previously mentioned, but also coal tar, another major ingredient in the graphite electrode. With syngas and coal tar acquired, the next stop was the sintering oven. While I initially worried over its high resource cost, it actually didn't turn out to be that annoying to build. Once finished, I made pitch blender by mixing coal tar and coke dust, and extruded it into a raw electrode, which I sintered into a not raw electrode, ready to put to use in a large electrolyzer that I don't have. It was time for my first real step into aluminium's disastrous recipe chain, the chlor-alkali process. Essentially, this is an industrial method of producing chlorine by electrolyzing water and salt water. The large electrolyzer used to perform the process only real cost was a large amount of steel, which I had thankfully acquired while waiting for all my wheat to grow. Once I had all the parts, I built the machine, plugged it in, and it began to work. However, it consumed a buttload of energy, and as I may have hinted at earlier, my boiler was being a pain in the ass. It consumed way too much fuel, so I could only run it when it was needed. But that resulted in a lack of steam buffer in moments like this when I'm running the electrolyzer. So, it worked, but it was incredibly slow. Now that the electrolyzer was running, I built the aluminium processing room, where I would, well, automate aluminium. Funnily enough, chlorine isn't even the chemical we want from the chlor-alkali process. It's sodium hydroxide. Now, this might be a doozy, but I'm going to try to explain the basics of the aluminium line while you watch me build it. Essentially, we pump sodium hydroxide into a roaster that has bauxite dust in it. This turns the bauxite into impure sodium aluminate, which is centrifuged in order to purify it. The sodium aluminate is then crystallized into aluminium hydroxide, which is blasted in an EBF. The resulting alumina now has two choices. One goes straight into another large electrolyzer, while the other is roasted with hydrofluoric acid into aluminium trifluoride, which is also loaded into the electrolyzer. After, all that and some cooked dust and cryolite, which isn't consumed, is loaded into the electrolyzer as well, which will result in aluminium ingots and some byproducts. What I didn't realize the first time I built this automation is that cryolite isn't consumed, so it wasn't worth automating. Unfortunately, I based this entire contraption around the automation of cryolite, so after I logged off for the day, I designed a system that would not only be more efficient, but would cycle all byproducts back into the system, so I didn't have to import the hydrofluoric acid and sodium hydroxide from elsewhere. After finishing the aluminium automation setup, I finally built an MV circuit out of pretty basic parts I had laying around, and an MV machine hull from the aluminium, finally ending the LV age. So yeah, thanks for watching. Probably gonna work on automating more in the MV age. I noticed while editing this video, most of the time recorded was just me walking back and forth putting code somewhere.